Righty ho. Morning, everybody. How are we?
Good on this side, Richard.
Excellent. Sorry, guys. I've had a bit of last-minute juggling with a couple of slides I thought I'd put into the deck, but I hadn't. So apologies. I've been flapping around at this end. So I think we're probably, are we good to go, do you think? Do we have everybody on that we're expecting?
Yes, I think we're good to go. And just to let everyone know, I am recording as well. So be mindful if you don't want your voice to be recorded or your video. But yes, we've got, I think most people here already. We've got 15 of us, which is really good. For those of us that can't make it, we'll provide the recording later.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. So welcome to the Microsoft School Transformation Program, the track for school technicians and IT managers. Just wanted to run you through the first few slides myself. My name's Richard Heaton. We do have a fairly sizable team of contributors and presenters, so people have helped us to build this content. So we have the team from the department in Cindy, Scott, Trudy, Josh, and Kylie. And we also have myself, Richard Heaton, and Troy Waller, who's one of our learning delivery specialists from Microsoft. And it's important that this whole team has been involved in this process because we've co-created the content to be appropriate for your environment in the South Australian central tenancy. So obviously, some of the settings and controls that go with that are basically administered and managed by the team that you see on here. And apologies, I seem to have managed to delete Scott's job title there and name. So that's Scott, second from the left at the top there. So very quickly, just running into the session description for today. We're going to take a look at the Microsoft 365 tool sets and very much with a focus on the apps and services that we provide as Microsoft through the departments to schools in South Australia that can enable school transformation. So it's really having a look at how all those different applications in the portfolio come together, the key capabilities of the major products in there, but also how you can enable those apps and services for your school to provide educators and leadership with what we're calling the desired end state. And we'll come on to that in more detail a little bit later. But before we sort of dive into that content, I just wanted to share a couple of graphs, the first of which is the usage of sort of Microsoft 365 core capabilities, so things like Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive for Business in the South Australian department schools from a period of December 19 right the way through to August. And what we can see there is a sharp uptick in many of those services around that March, April time, which is where we saw the first effects of COVID and potential lockdowns and a real increase in the use of technology to deliver remote learning. Suffice to say, this is a pattern that we've seen replicated around the world. In some cases, even more extreme examples where many students are still learning remotely. Many students are still, not able to go into schools. I've also got a second graph here, which shows sort of over from the sort of end of that period. We've seen the big increase on the left-hand side there. I watch it sort of level off. It drops slowly in South Australia, but the levels are still much higher than we saw pre-COVID. The interesting thing is after the major school holidays in the summer, we see this bounce back. So ultimately what we're seeing is a shift in how technology is used in the classroom, because you guys have been back in the classroom for a long time now, a sort of Easter time last year. And yet we're still seeing this increased role for technology such as Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive in terms of that teaching and learning experience. So what we call this is hybrid learning at Microsoft. My personal preference is to call it technology-enabled learning. So the importance of technology in helping to deliver good outcomes for students, improve teachers' lives, whether that be remotely or whether that be in the classroom or a mix of both. So just a bit of context as to the sort of increasing importance of some of the things we'll be talking about today. So the agenda for today is to provide you with a bit of an overview of the school transformation program. We'll take a look at that desired end state. So what's the technology platform which will enable leadership and the educators in your schools to deliver the kind of transformation that they're looking for. Some of those considerations we have working in a large environment. There are 900 plus school sites in the South Australian environment. Then we'll sort of zoom in or double click down on Microsoft Teams, because that's the specific area of technology where Microsoft is probably investing the most. And we would sort of term this as being a digital hub for education. So we'll look at those key components and capabilities, have a quick break, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things down at the end point. So things like some of the changes in browser compatibility and availability. Troy will deep dive into accessibility for us, which is a super important subject. Impacts many students and teachers across the environment. And then we'll have a look at Microsoft 365 apps, sort of also known as Office 365 Pro Plus, and why it's really important that we get onto the latest versions and we stay current. A little bit of guidance on deployment, and then touch on OneDrive and some school templates. Now, I'm a bit of an old dog, and teaching me new tricks is difficult, so I tend to use some of the terminology interchangeably. So if I say Office 365 Pro Plus, what I really mean is Microsoft 365 apps as the new name. And if we're talking about Configuration Manager or SCCM, it's really Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager that I'm talking about. So the origins of today's session is as part of a bigger program that Troy Waller, my colleague, has designed and built. It's become a bit of a sort of global best practice, I suppose. So we're very privileged to have him here in Australia, thinking about how we develop capability in schools to use the Microsoft platform. But as I mentioned before, it was co-created with the team from the department, who had some really valuable and vital inputs into areas of the presentation, to make sure that we're not just giving you how this works in a standard Microsoft environment where one school has its own tenancy, has its own access to the admin console, has full control and full responsibility for that environment. This is a different environment that we're working in, and we've tried to respect that in the presentation. As we go through the presentation today, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat window or come off mute. We'll be more than happy to do our best to answer those, whether it be from the Microsoft side or whether it be from the department side. So I'll just hand over now to Troy, who'll take us through the Microsoft School Transformation Program.
Thanks, Troy. Appreciate it. So the Microsoft School Transformation Program, as it says there, is a free professional learning program to transform the way teachers and students use technology that they already have at their fingertips. And of course, we really include yourselves as technology professionals in that space. What we tried to do was bring the entire school together and get them talking about this. So it's an entire school program, and we broke it down into 4 basic groups within the school, and then we tailored some PD to them, and we also had a bit of a newbies workshop as well. So Rich, if you could skip to the next slide. So and you can build that out for me, thanks. So it's built on the Microsoft K-12 Education Transformation Framework, which is what we call the ETF. We love an acronym at Microsoft. Built on those 4 areas. So you can see things like leadership and policy, which is your school leaders, teaching and learning, which is going to be obviously the teachers, the middle leaders, teachers' aides, and that includes students to a degree as well. Intelligent environments, which is probably where we might traditionally put yourselves and what you're doing in the school, and then of course the student and school success overall, which is really the intent of everything that we're trying to do. So those 4 areas come together, and as I said, we break that down into workshops where we tailor the messaging and the story and exactly what it is what we're trying to achieve to each of those individual groups. But again, trying to bring you guys together and start to have conversations about where your school's headed. Thanks, Rich. So the first thing we do is we have a leadership workshop, which is run by my colleague, Travis Smith, who's a former AP. He was actually assistant principal. I told you we love an acronym. He was involved in the first ever government school in the world to have a one-to-one program, which was Frankston High in Melbourne. And that was a low socioeconomic school, and there was so much going against them in terms of pricing, in terms of, just the culture of the school, etc. But it was really quite a success. And of course, Microsoft snapped him up quick, smart. So he runs this, and he brings the leadership together to create, or continue to create, if the school's already on that path, a shared vision for the digital transformation of the school. And you can see the people that we have involved in that, the principal, the deputy principals, the sort of middle leaders around technology in your school, and ICT staff and ICT directors if they're involved, if the school's that big. Thanks, Rich. The next stage is what we call the MIE Trainer Academy, or we also call it the E-Learning Leaders Institute. And that is to upskill the educators in your school, the middle leaders, to support and deliver professional development. And what they do is they build a project out where they look at a tool or a feature within a tool and working with a small group in your school to adopt that tool and then to drive usage around that. And so the idea for this, that the project that they run, is to get them some experience in bringing something new. So we do a little bit of change management, we do a little bit of project management, we do a little bit of introduction to tools and that kind of thing. And so again, this is your middle leaders in the school around the e-learning space, e-learning leaders, digital leaders, curriculum managers, those kinds of people, and any aspiring classroom teachers as well. Thanks, Rich. The inclusive classroom, something very near and dear to my heart. It is extremely important, and it's something that we're going to sort of talk to you about today, because this really depends a lot on technology and depends a lot on people like yourselves switching this on and making sure that it's working, you know, really well in the school. So we show e-learning leaders, learning support leaders, learning support teachers, teachers' aides, any support professionals in your school are welcome to come as well, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, etc. And again, classroom teachers in that space. And they learn how the Microsoft technologies that the department has already rolled out to them, that are already there, can support students with learning and physical needs. So it's really helping those kids that need that little bit of extra support with that extra support. And the technology does a lot of the heavy lifting. So that's a big part of what goes on there. Thanks, Rich. The last one that we have, well, actually, of course, there's the IT professionals, which you're in the middle of, and trying to get you guys to speak in that space. But the other one that we offered, and this was a huge hit in South Australia, and that is a Discover Microsoft 365 for newbies. Because there's no point coming in and talking about projects and shared vision and all this kind of stuff if people don't understand the basics of the platform. So it's to introduce the tools to educators and school leaders and basically anyone that's new to M365. We had whole school teams coming along to this workshop, and others sending new staff and that kind of stuff.
Wonderful, thanks Troy. So I just wanted to step you through now what today's session will attempt to cover. Less of an agenda and more the sort of philosophy behind it, I suppose. So Troy and I come from different parts of the Microsoft business to some extent. Troy's an ex-educator. I'm more on the technical side. So when I found out about the school transformation program and he asked me to help with the technicians track, my first thought was, what is it that, I put myself in your shoes. What is Microsoft telling these educators and leaders? What are they going to come back and ask for? Because as the primary technical contacts within those environments, you'll be expected to, or they'll come back wanting or hoping or asking for certain platforms to be in place, certain capabilities to be in place, so they can do all the wonderful stuff that Troy and Travis have talked about in the inclusive classroom with Microsoft 365 and at a leadership level. So what we wanted to do was just make sure you had that overview of what all the sessions were, so you understood what people might be coming back expecting. But why also it's important to provide this desired end state. So this is going to be a real focus for us today, is why we need certain things in place. Why is it important to an educator that their version of Microsoft 365 apps is up to date and they're not running Office 2016? How then can that technology support school transformation? And also a little bit, where can we go for more technical guidance? So many of the topics we'll touch on today in their own right could be a 2 or 3 day workshop. So, desktop deployment, managing, Office 365, Microsoft 365 apps. So what we'll do there is we'll link off to the most appropriate resources, so you can get more detail if you need to in those particular areas. So, and just on that, we've done a great job at Microsoft over the past few years of consolidating where our documentation lies. Docs.microsoft.com really is the place to go for all of these things. Many of the links that we'll share with you today do go off to docs.microsoft.com. So we touched earlier on this concept of the desired end state and what your teachers and educators will be, demanding, hoping for, desiring when they come back from Troy and Travis's workshops. So we wanted to kind of give you a bit of a cut down architectural view of how that hangs together in the Microsoft 365 space. which will then lead into some of those conversations about, how do we configure and how do we deploy these particular technologies. So we've sliced the layer cake into three simple layers. At the bottom, we have our identity, and then we have our Office 365 or Microsoft 365 cloud services, and then we have that end user experience. So as we look at the identity side of things, that's pretty much all looked after by the department. They have their provisioning tools. They create the student accounts into the Office 365 environment and provide with an @schools.sa.edu.au username. Sitting on top of that within Microsoft Cloud is a group of common Office 365 services. So these are really, really important from a department perspective because they give a degree of control, the ability to deal with compliance requirements. So things like the ability to search across, emails, SharePoint libraries, Teams chats, etc. Do that e-discovery in the event that there might be a legal case or something similar. There's then a whole raft of tools that allow you to put particular matters on legal hold, for example, and use them as part of an investigation. So having that visibility, that ability to control and manage the environment at a central level through those central services is super, super important. Then on top of those, we have some of those sort of classic applications that we run out of Office or Microsoft 365. So the big hitters like SharePoint Online, Exchange Online have been around for a long time, but also those other applications that may have a really strong educational usage. So things like OneNote with our class notebook add-in, things like Microsoft Stream for video and meeting recordings, Yammer, Planner, Forms for assessment, etc. There's a whole raft of capabilities in there that I've sort of shoved into that third bucket. But increasingly and probably strategically, the wrapper that goes around all of these is Microsoft Teams. So we saw, as on the graphs earlier, a huge uptick in Microsoft Teams. It integrates with, but also provides a wrap around SharePoint, Exchange, and many of the other applications in Microsoft 365. So from a strategic direction, Microsoft Teams is something that we'd certainly urge you to understand more about. It's very likely that your school will be looking to use that if they're not already at some point in the future, and not necessarily just for the voice video meetings capability. There's a whole bunch of other educational capabilities built in that we'll touch on in a moment. And then it comes down to the end user experience as well. So I've been with Microsoft a little over 15 years, and I think it's safe to say we're a lot more device and operating system agnostic than we used to be. So you really do have your choice of client device, whether that be a PC or a Mac, a smartphone, Android or iOS, or a tablet. And then we access these services sitting on the Microsoft Cloud through a range of different capabilities, whether it be through our Office 365 or Microsoft 365 apps, through the browsers. And again, we support all the major flavors of browser, but also mobile apps sitting on those Android and iOS phones. So a very lightweight kind of architectural view of how the layer cake builds up, and wrapping around that, which again is of great importance to the department with the duty of care that they have, is the user-based security and management that we can apply at all levels of the stack. So that's our desired end state. We need to be able to deliver to our teachers and our students and our leadership, a solid identity platform, the core Office 365 services, and a good end user experience. If we can tick those boxes, then we've done 95% of what we need to give them that desired end state. But first, before we get into any more of that, a word on the environment that we're working in. It is an environment of 800-900 school sites, all with slightly different requirements. And I work across the Victorian and Tasmanian departments as well, and there is a common challenge. It's how do we find the right balance between sort of centralized control and delegated administration? And look, it's something that we're working really hard on at Microsoft to make this easier for these types of larger environments. And at the moment, hand on heart, it's not perfect, but we are making progress in many of these areas. So what this means in these kind of large multi-site environments, we need to find that right balance between what needs to be done centrally and what we can do at a site level. And ultimately, it really does come down to who has to accept responsibility for things like security and duty of care. And in these types of environment, it comes down to the department to be responsible. So what that means for you is you're probably not going to get full global admin access to the tenant for Microsoft 365, but the department will provide a tool set that enables you to do many of the things that you need to do to build out that desired end state. And we will touch on a couple of those shortly. So again, taking a quick look at that desired end state and what we'll cover today. Over on the right-hand side here, we have some of those things that are controlled at the central level. So things like identity provisioning, Teams policies, and some of those settings that are tenant-wide. So they impact all schools or all users within the tenant. But what we'll be focusing more on today, you need to understand some of those settings, and we'll touch on that. But what we'll focus on more today is over on the left-hand side, and provide you with that view of the platform, some of those scenarios that we have in education, some of the configuration that you are able to do and able to help with. So advising on things like Teams channel structures and understanding, how that works in a secondary school versus a primary school. There's also the kind of end user pieces as well. So what browsers do we want to have in place? How do we stay current with Microsoft 365 apps, and what are our deployment options? And then how accessibility is woven through the entirety of the Microsoft platform to help those students who have challenges with learning. So again, we'll be aiming to provide the context for why these things are important to your school leaders and teaching staff, and then link off to useful resources on the technology side. So with that said, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is something from the right-hand side around Teams policies. So the department has done a lot of work in this space, and it's a good example of something that has to be centrally controlled. These are policies that relate to things like messaging, meetings, calling, and they can control the behavior that's experienced on the client side. There are only really a few client-side configurations that need to be made with Teams. Mostly they're things like personalized settings for notifications and alerts, and the rest is set by central policy. So when your teachers and educators are looking at videos of Teams online, and there are things that they see perhaps in a YouTube video that they can't do in the department environment, the first place I would look to is these Teams policies. So there is a KB article there that will detail which of those policies are enacted and what's switched on and switched off for students. So broadly speaking, the student policy is more restrictive than the staff policy or the standard policy to restrict or reduce the risk of misuse of the tools that are available. So, for example, things like, there's one policy here, which is allow private meet now. It's enabled for staff, but disabled for students. The department has taken the view they don't want students to be able to just start an ad hoc meeting between themselves and another student for reasons of duty of care. So there are new policies coming out all the time. So one recent example would be we changed the settings to control meeting roles, or the default meeting roles, to ensure students join as attendees, not presenters. So as these policies iterate and improve over time, the department will be implementing the relevant ones. So really good KB to go and have a look at. If you have questions around those policies, talk to the department about, the origins of why those settings are set. But it helps you understand why things are available or aren't available within the Teams interface for your schools. Scott or anybody from the department side, any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I will. Hi everyone. I will mention that at the moment there's only two policies, so really it's faculty as in staff and student, which is based on the license type. We are looking towards doing more policies, so based by group, as in like an upper and lower year level, or perhaps even a group for each year level, and then we'd have a bit more options around what policies. So maybe year 11s and 12s can get they can have ad hoc meetings and whatnot. There is a bit of a problem at the moment with applying those by groups. So as soon as we can work through those, we should be able to implement that. At the moment, it's because the groups are so large, because we've got 240 odd sort of 1,000 users. It's not sort of built for that at the moment, but hopefully soon we can push that out.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And we have similar conversations in Victoria where they have, a very restrictive default student policy, but the schools are allowed to apply for an exceptions policy, which has slightly relaxed policies in certain areas. So they've agreed certain things can be done by, I think it's the principal, or authorised by the principal. They can change across. There's a few different approaches to take there, but yeah, we should probably have another chat about that. Scott, there's probably some things we can share with Victoria and back and forth.
All right, cool.
The second thing I just wanted to cover off as well, and again, I'll probably ask Scott to jump in a moment if there's anything I've missed, but you'll probably be aware how to do this. But onboarding your sites and users to 365 is a relatively simple process. It's outlined in this KB article. So go to LearnLink, EduPortal, site configuration, Office 365, select your site, and then activate Office 365 services. So switch on the required services that are available that your school wants. We suggest leaving Skype off unless you have an absolute need for it. That's basically becoming end of life, and all that functionality has been rolled into Teams. At a minimum, we'd look at these products that are listed here on the left-hand side of the slide. So SharePoint, 365 Pro Plus or M365 apps, SharePoint Online and OneDrive, Teams, Forms and Stream. We can also provide access to a number of other capabilities through there, but we won't be focusing on those in depth today. So again, Scott or the team from the department, anything to add?
Not so much. This is the same function that's been available since 365's come out with the department. I think from memory, maybe Skype is either not there anymore or will be removed due to it being end of life soon. So Teams is taken over kind of completely from that. So the rest of it should be the same. There is also, I guess I'll mention possibilities for reception to Year 2 to be enabled as well. So you probably don't just default to that, but if you need that for whatever reason with the teachers doing the lower year levels, then just log a request and we can see what we can do.
Awesome, thanks, Scott. And then the final piece on this desired end state is a little checklist that we put together, broken down by the kind of cloud services and then the client side. So we'd recommend, if you're going to produce this environment for your school to operate in, over on the left, make sure those services are switched on, make sure you've gone through that activation process we just shared, understand those Teams policies because you'll probably get questions on those. Then sort of work a little bit on Teams creation. We'll come to that a little bit later in the session, and configuration, and also switch on, if appropriate, the SharePoint templates. That is the very last piece of today's session. On the client side, which I think is probably where the majority of your work will lie, we really need to make sure you've got Microsoft 365 apps installed. So there is a big difference, and we'll go a little bit deeper on this in a moment, between the older versions of Office, the old MSI or 2019 Click to Run version versus the kind of always up-to-date evergreen Microsoft 365 apps. Also need to make sure we've got the Teams client deployed, and we'll talk a little bit about that again later in the session. The OneNote Windows 10 app is deployed. That's a critical piece of capability for our educational technology. Edge Chromium browser is deployed. There's been some announcements recently about end of life for Edge Legacy, or the original Edge as we call it. And the OneDrive Sync client is installed as well. So, as you're going through preparing your school for transformation through 365, these are probably the 10 boxes you need to be able to tick off to know that you're in a pretty good place to start. So that's enough about the desired end state. What we wanted to do now is just take you through a little bit on Microsoft Teams. As I mentioned before, this has become a really, really strong focal point for Microsoft, where a lot of our investment is going, both in the classroom, in the education version of Teams, but also in the corporate world outside and the government world. We're seeing this as really very much the future of Microsoft 365, very much almost like a meta operating system type environment. So the place that you go to do your work, and we surface up lots of other capability within that. So for the first part of this, I'm just going to hand over to Troy, who will just step us through the next couple of slides. Thanks, Troy.
Thanks, Rich. Just before I do jump right into Teams, I did want to point out that what I have been sharing with the teachers and leaders from your school is the office.com start page. Introducing them to the ability to access the cloud-based apps, one of those being Teams, that they can be having the Teams the browser-based app open at the same time as the app. But I have also been encouraging them to download the app themselves if they've got admin privileges to install software. And so it's important that we get that out to the student devices and that kind of thing as well. Thanks, Rich. The other thing I'm pointing out to them on this slide is the ability to download Office 365 apps to their local device from this office.com page. And that, when we talk about accessibility a little bit later, the reason why that really matters is because a lot of the education features are rolled out, into updates of M365 apps. Whereas if they're on a static image of 2019 or even 2016, then they're on an old version of Office. So a lot of your teachers may be coming back to you and talking to you because, for example, when they start to install some of this stuff, they may hit snags and bits and pieces, and it's really helpful to them in what they're trying to achieve through what we train them over this month, that you help them overcome these barriers and don't shove, and not that any of you would ever do this, but not sort of shoving them back to 2019 or 2016, but actually helping them move forward with this. Thanks, Rich. So coming into Teams, and again, what I'm going to do for you folks now is present to you in the way and the messaging that I have been sharing with the teachers, right? So talking to them about Teams being this hub, this one location for everything. And that is that they can manage their course materials with things like Teams and obviously SharePoint being, almost one in the same, and then the integration with OneNote in there. In terms of creating cohorts, because it's a central tenant, the ability to connect with student information systems and that kind of thing is quite different to what people with schools with their own tenants see. But teachers are still able to use things like DL groups, join links, join codes, these kinds of things to easily update their students and get them into a team. When we see their video content and also lesson streaming content, I saw you fishing there, Rich, we can bring those two together, right? That is, we can be uploading video content that we've pre-built or that we've found elsewhere straight into Teams, but we can also be recording our lessons and having those accessible later. The assessments and the assignments really come together. We can do things across Microsoft 365 with forms, etc. And also using Word, but bringing all that into Teams as well as the dedicated assignments features within Teams brings an LMS. There's one of those acronyms again, the Learning Management System sort of features into the Teams experience. And if a school has a dedicated LMS, like if they're using Frog or if they're using another one that they've chosen, we still have a better together story to tell that we can still be using a dedicated LMS with Teams. The inclusive learning, we'll jump into it a little bit later, but again, that's really key. The technology has to be updated regularly for people to see these new features. And as we build relationships with these teachers through social media and start telling them about the stuff that's available, they're going to come to you and say, can we switch it on? Can we have that working in our school? Because it's an equity and inclusion issue. Integration with other apps, things like Calendar and Planner as well. And then lastly, I'm going to let Rich speak to this for a moment, because the idea of this all sitting on analytics and Microsoft Graph and that kind of thing is really quite important.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. So yeah, I guess one of the main differences with cloud-based technology and particularly M365, when we compare it to many of these applications would have been available standalone or on-premise over the years, things like Exchange or SharePoint, is the underlying graph database that we have sitting underneath it, which basically collects information about the usage of Microsoft 365 apps and services. And we're starting to now surface that up and make it available to education systems, schools, teachers, leadership, etc., to help understand the levels of digital engagement that students have during, for example, times of remote learning. It's become a very big focus. So we're working on a really exciting project with Tasmania at the moment, which is taking all that telemetry from Microsoft 365. Firstly, we surface it up through a first-party application in Teams called Insights, which is available today, but also exporting that out into a data lake, where we're then starting to merge it with other sorts of information. So things like NAPLAN results, or information coming from their Canvas learning management system, or information about case management for students who are deemed to be at risk. So some really, really important stuff we can it's not the main data set they're using coming out of Microsoft or Office 365, but it's a really, really important one to help flesh out the understanding of how a student's engaging with the education system. So we think there's going to be a lot more work in this space in the coming years. It's certainly a really, really, really exciting area to work in.
And can I speak to that just quickly, Richard, from a teacher's perspective? When I was teaching, the idea of data and being told, collecting data and everything, just, I used to, put the finger gun to my head, because the idea of the work that is needed by the teacher to collect data, to then use that data, put it into spreadsheets and send it off to someone. And then, of course, you need, people that know how to read that and use it in meaningful ways. What I love about what's coming with Insights is that data is collected by us, by Microsoft, by the department, and then it's presented back to teachers in really meaningful ways. And the teacher's not having to spend time on that data collection or even on that interpretation. It's actually all being brought back to them. And I think that's a real game changer for what's coming through that Insights tab.
That's right. And there's also some kind of corrective actions that could be taken through the future versions of the Insights app as well. So, for example, if I set a piece of homework using an assignment in Teams that has a background reading that's in a Word document, and I know that Troy hasn't opened the Word document on Thursday and the homework's due in on Friday, I could potentially, a little drop down, quick chat with Troy. Hey, Troy, I see you haven't started your homework. You might want to think about, getting on with that, or do you need an extension? Are there other circumstances in your life that mean that you won't be able to get that in by Friday? So some really interesting little nudges we can start to build into that if we have the right technology platform in place. So apologies for this random icon at the bottom here. I was fiddling around with them yesterday. I've clearly forgot to do the animation correctly here, but as I mentioned before, Teams is a really critical piece for Microsoft these days. That's because it's so much more than meetings and chat and voice calling. It's a place where everything comes together in a form of what we call a digital hub. So we see it as that kind of cloud operating system, a place that you go to do your work and access capability from a multitude of different services and applications. But again, it's accessible on any device. So there's a certain inbuilt capability. So the ability to do that one-on-one or group chat, the ability to work together in teams and manage calls and meetings, the education-specific functions like delivering assignments and grading those assignments. They're all sort of part of the Teams fabric, but it's really where the power starts to kick in is when we look at what else we can bring into Teams. So all of those Microsoft 365 applications can be brought in. It's quite often the case that people will be using things like forms for assessment. They might be using, Stream for video content, and all the rest of the Microsoft platform comes to bear. But the key thing with having all this in one place is that these inbuilt collaboration capabilities, whether it be, chat, for example, it's the context within which that chat and that conversation takes place. So collaboration is so much more powerful when it's done in context, whether you're working together on files in a team, perhaps you're meeting in a channel or chatting one-on-one. So a whole different way of working if you can have all your applications brought to one place and then those collaboration capabilities wrap around that rather than having to jump off to different applications to do your work. So we extend the Teams core capability with Microsoft 365. We also extend it with a raft of third parties as well. So things like Kahoot, YouTube, etc., commonly used in educational environments, but also enterprise applications as well if you're working on the government side of the department systems. And then finally, on the right-hand side, the ability to effectively have unlimited possibilities for the applications that you build within Teams, kicking off workflow processes and delivering greater productivity. So we've got 45 plus Microsoft apps that can embed into Teams natively. Troy will touch on that later. But there's also 650 plus third-party applications, and then a whole, unlimited volume of potential applications you might build out using, custom tools. You could be using Power Platform, or you could be using some of the app templates that Microsoft has created for Teams. So the notion really is Teams at the center, all of your applications potentially embedded over time, gives you one place to go and do your work. So how does that manifest itself when we take a look at Teams interface together? So in practical terms, bringing it all together in one place really is important for that workflow. So teachers can communicate on curriculum content through chat. They can store and collaborate on the documents, deliver these as assignments to student, grade and assess these assignments, provide feedback, and even deliver online lessons via video conferencing, recording that session for use later and keeping it as a digital asset. So just looking at this Teams screen, we have an Exchange online calendar. So why build a calendar when you have one in Exchange? The departments, teachers and students all in Exchange today, Exchange online. So we surface that up through Teams as the calendar app. We have file storage coming from SharePoint and OneDrive, all of which actually sits in the SharePoint platform, which allows us to take advantage of those common services like search, e-discovery, and the compliance services sitting behind. So wherever you see a file in Teams, that file's actually sitting in SharePoint at the back end, surfaced up through Teams, whether it be in the app on the left-hand side, as an attachment that's been uploaded through a chat, or through the kind of access to the document libraries through that Files tab at the top, which is straight into SharePoint. We also have a lot of those capabilities that used to be in Skype for Business. So the ability to do that chat, one-on-one or group chat, instant message, the ability to run meetings, the ability to do calls. Skype Online is disappearing this year. Skype for Business on-premise will be a couple of years after that. So as we said before, all that functionality is being subsumed into Teams. So we've got things coming from Exchange, we've got things coming from SharePoint and OneDrive, we've got the old Skype capability, and we've got the ability to add in across the top here any of those other Microsoft 365 apps as a tab, which will then embed the functionality of that application into that environment. So it might be as simple as embedding a form that you wish to use to do some form of assessment within a class team. We also then have the educational tools, so things like OneNote Class Notebook is natively integrated into class teams, and we have those other education specific functions, so in this case assignments and the gradebook as well. So really, really rich level of functionality just coming from the Microsoft stack, and then we have the ability to build in that third-party integration, whether that be into your LMS or whether it be into another educational application. So hopefully that gives you a visualization of where all those bits of Teams are coming from, and the idea that really is that point of aggregation for all things Microsoft as well as other application vendors. So with that, I'll pass over to Troy, who'll talk a little bit about within that Teams framework, how do we go about creating teams and what approaches do we take?
Thanks, Rich. In the more generalized sort of commercial version of Teams, there is only one kind of team that you can create. But when we look at education, there's 4 types of teams. So what we call other is your standard team. It builds a team, it builds the SharePoint site. You've still got all sorts of integrations that you can bring with apps, etc. But coming back to the very start of this slide, you can see we've got class teams. So what class teams do is, as it denotes, it's for working with the students. It creates the team, it creates the relevant SharePoint sites for each individual channel, but it brings a OneNote Class Notebook, which is a special, if you don't know, it's a special type of OneNote that brings the entire class together and allows for page distribution and all that kind of stuff. And it integrates really well with Teams. There's unique teacher and student permissions and education specific features. So things like the assignments tool, other things like students aren't able to just leave the team, that they lose that control, because you could imagine, students would just accidentally or on purpose leave the team, and then they're missing out on everything that's going on. So things like that happen in there as well. We've also got the professional learning community team, which is obviously for teachers and school staff. Again, it's got the team and the relevant SharePoint sites for the channel, but what it also does is creates a professional learning community notebook. And so that's for teachers to work together in professional development, professional learning. The other one is the staff team. Again, creates the team, creates the relevant SharePoint sites for the channels, but it creates a unique kind of notebook again, which is called a staff notebook. Very similar to the class notebook, except the terms are different, but the ability to push pages out, to differentiate content, etc., all happening in there, and its integration with Teams. However, when we are working with schools, our advice to schools is not to use the staff notebook as the whole school employee or in the whole school staff team, because the limitations with that staff notebook and having that there in that sort of communication portal may not be what schools want, and for most schools it's not what they want. Instead, a staff team may be around sort of professional development plans and that sort of thing. We recommend that whole school teams are actually set up in the other, because you can bring OneNotes in if you want to and create OneNotes in that space, and you've got more granularity, more control as to what that's going to look like, rather than a determined staff notebook. So it's kind of a little bit counterintuitive that create a whole staff team, use other, not staff team. But yeah, that's our recommendation. Thanks, Rich. Another thing that we do want to point out is that when you create a class team, it is automatically private. So nobody can accidentally stumble onto that. But when you create the other kinds of teams, you can create them as public, which means that people within the department can see these teams and can join them on a whim. And that's probably not where you want to go. So we really want to stress that, you know, the majority, if not all of your teams would in fact be private, and make that the habit that you get into when you start setting up teams for teachers or others in your school. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Rich.
Oh, look, just that, you know, you're working in an environment with 200,000 students or so on the network. If somebody does create a public team, sometimes the fact that it's public gets lost on people, and so any chat or any documents that you store in there are immediately visible to anybody who joins that team, which could be any one of those teachers or students in your environment. So the strongest levels of advice would be to keep almost all your teams private teams, create them as private teams, unless there's a very specific reason why you might want that to be a public team.
Yeah, you'd probably find your public teams are going to be more stuff done at a department level rather than individual school level, I would say.
Can I just add that if it's public, any file stored in there will show up in a SharePoint search, including from OneDrive. So just because they don't know the teams there and haven't joined the team, there's a possibility they can still access your files.
Yep. I think it's a great point, and we'll sort of touch on this a little bit later on, but maybe it's good to cover it now. But the boundary of security for a team and the files stored within it are the members of that team. There's one exception, which is where we might create a private channel within a team, which is a subset of the users of that team. So if it's a private team, we name the individuals who are in the team. That's the level of permission that they're the people who have permission to the files and chats within that team, whether it be via SharePoint or through the Teams interface. So yeah, super important point that Scott, thanks for that.
All right, so thinking about primary school teams and what it's going to look like, this is definitely something that needs to be done with collaboratively with the school leadership. And with any sort of teachers that are involved. I would really recommend against technicians like yourself setting up entire school structures by themselves. I think it does need to be done with collaboration and consultation from the leadership and anybody else. So first of all, what we do suggest though is that we create all staff teams, and that's what I was talking about before, using that other kind of team. And that provides a central place for staff to communicate and collaborate. And I'll take you in and show you what that looks like in a minute. It provides a location for secure file storage and sharing, and channels to focus on different domains of interest. And what that looks like when I speak to school leaders, as I say, you've got this on-prem servers in your school that you've spent a fair amount of capital expenditure, let alone operational expenditure, keeping that air conditioned and running and all that kind of stuff. Moving that into Teams means that it lives in the cloud. It's got accessibility regardless of device, all that kind of stuff. There's so many advantages for that. Now, obviously, that your school may in fact need to have a continued on-prem server for sensitive documentation, etc. No doubt, but nevertheless, moving that across is key, and that's what we're recommending to schools to do. You've got channels, of course, to focus on different domains of interest and different groups within the school. Then the second type of team we've got is the leadership team. This is a separate team away from all staff. So again, people can't be stumbling onto the information contained in there. It's where leadership business managers, principals assistants, deputy principals, those kinds of people can have access to conversations and files, specific to them. Again, sensitive file storage and sharing. And as with the all staff team, you do have the ability to create private channels as you can see there, to ensure confidentiality for specific topics. However, what we recommend is as few private channels as possible, because that way you're not having to manage those. Who's in there, who's got access day to day, that kind of thing. So we do recommend that you keep that to a minimum where possible. You don't want to be having 5 and 10 private channels. As a matter of fact, if you are having five or 10 private channels, that may actually call for unique teams. Anyway, and then the other one in a primary school setting is class teams. So you would find, each grade level, and then the classes within those grade levels would have their own teams. The homeroom or classroom teacher would be managing that, as well as bringing in the specialists, and I'll take you in and show you what that looks like. But again, curriculum resources, learning engagements for the kids, and of course, if there is any sort of school closure due to bushfires, floods, of course, COVID, or anything like that, it's all waiting for the kids to turn up and switch on. I'll let you speak to this one, Rich.
Yeah, sure. And obviously bearing in mind that all of that is underpinned by the core services in Microsoft 365, so cloud-based access anywhere on any device, and you've got that enterprise security and compliance that we've touched on before. So starting with that user-based security in Azure AD, but maybe even extending out in the future to things like conditional access for multi-factor authentication, those retention policies for documents that may be sensitive in that leadership or all staff team, things that we have to keep as a record for 7 years or 99 years or whatever it may be, and then that searchability through e-discovery and legal hold. So that's the kind of primary school structure. Troy, we'll just move on and now look at the secondary school.
Yeah, so secondary school is very similar. You've got an all-staff team. The channels and the domains are going to look different, but it's basically the same sort of purpose. So too with leadership. Where it gets different, though, in the secondary environment is when we start to move into faculty teams. Because in the primary area, you're going to have, and this will make more sense when I show you in a moment, but you're going to have year level teams that can work together, not only because it's smaller, usually primary schools are smaller, but just the way that it's structured. When you get into secondary, you're going to have breakaway faculty teams. That is, you're going to have, maybe 7 to 10 science, and then you might have dedicated SACE physics, SACE chem, SACE biology, etc., because they need that greater level of granularity in the way that they work together. So this is just for the staff. Then you have dedicated math faculty and that kind of thing as well. And then the classes, of course, that's going to look very different. Whereas in the primary, the students will probably just have one team where the teachers come to them. When we get into secondary, though, the classes are different cohorts with different teachers. So a student's going to have one maths team, one English team, one science team, one PE team, all these kinds of teams built like that. Whereas in primary, of course, it's all happening in the one space. So there's a lot more teams in the secondary area, and that's because they're needed. But our advice is you only create a new team when there's a definite need, when there's a definite mandate. Because what you don't want is the Amazon jungle of every man and his dog, every woman and his dog, her dog, running teams, and that you're having to keep some fingers across everything. So we want to keep everything as streamlined as possible.
Yep, and to that end, Troy, probably worth touching there on the kind of lifecycle management policies as well. So I believe it's still set as a sort of 12-month expiry on teams. So when we've got a team that's been created, the owners of that team will get a warning to say, your team's coming up for expiry. Do you wish to renew that environment and roll it over again for another 12 months? So we also there see, and perhaps I will just jump back briefly to the previous slide there. We do see a slight difference in some of these teams. So a class team might well only last for 12 months because year 8 physics G is going to be Year 8 Physics G in 2021. There's also going to be one in 2022, 2023, etc. Different team members, potentially different content. Whereas the all-staff team is probably a more permanent team, or the leadership team will be more permanent. Maybe even those faculty teams where they're developing curriculum. So we've got this notion of some teams that will be short-lived. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's less than that. Other teams that will be longer-lived, maybe even permanent in terms of their duration. And so with that, I'll hand back over to Troy just to jump in and take us through teams.
So having a look here at my teams, these are a whole heap of demo teams that I've sort of got set up. I'm just going to show you really quickly because, as I said, this is more sort of something that's going to happen in a collaborative, consultative sort of way with your school leadership, and we have talked to them about the structures of teams. But you can see here the staff primary, we've got, you know, all these domains like facilities and grounds, library, parent comms, etc. And I realized that we really need an ICT channel in there as well. But you can see this is where the reception team are working together, the Year 1 team, the Year 2 team, etc. And then, you know, some of these sort of consultative committees and, you know, English curriculum teams all happening in there. And this is where the teachers are genuinely working together, building their curriculum out. So you can see that what the conversation that they're having, and also what once upon a time was kept on the on-prem shared drive is now kept in their unique Teams channel. And everyone is able to see what everyone else is doing, but they can hide and show channels and, you know, play with their notifications so they're not bombarded and overwhelmed with too much, but they're also able to make sure that they're on top of everything that they need to be on top of. So that's what that staff team looks like there. Now, when we look at the staff of the secondary, very similar, except this is not about curriculum areas, which it was before. This is now more about, you know, the Year 7 team might be talking about an incursion that's coming, or the camp that's coming up, and everyone that needs to be aware of those notifications can be happening. It can be in there, discussing things, looking at files, etc. The leadership teams, very, very similar, whether you're in a secondary or a primary. And you can see here we've got things like facilities again, finance, human resources, leadership planning. You can see those channels are locked because we want to make sure that only the people that need to access those documents are able to. So, you know, this is not doing away with the need for, you know, their admin machines and everything that needs to happen in that space. It's as well as, okay? The other thing that we see here when we look at the class teams, so let's go and have a look. Here's a grade 1 team really quickly. So you can see the grade 1 team, they've got all, the grade 1 class, this student view, they've got all their learning areas in the one team. However, when we get into secondary, well, each one of these would be a dedicated, each one of these subjects would be a dedicated team. So you can see here, this is their English team. And so they've got, instead of having different learning areas, they've actually just got different unit topics or whatever it is that they're working on in that space. So again, many more teams and multiple teams for each student in secondary, whereas in primary, different story. And there's all those staff faculty teams, okay? So this is where, whereas before what we saw in primary, it's up here that curriculum is happening in the one team. It's breaking down right across the different learning areas, you know, and as I said before, they just need that deeper level of granularity. I will also show you just quickly, in case you haven't had much of a chance to look at teams, let's jump into this here. So as I said before, if we come into the Year 1 space, they have a conversation, so they're able to wrap their files in conversation. They're able to talk to each other about what matters. They're able to keep their files in the one spot, but also they're able to keep tabs across the top here. So, you know, anything that's got a web portal can be brought in. They've got, you know, documents that are more relevant to them at any sort of point, and it's dynamic, it's not static. So this can be changed, you know, minute by minute. And you can see here the kind of things that we can bring in as tabs. It's not just their Microsoft stuff, it's third-party apps as well. And there's a whole heap of education things in there, but it goes much broader than education, and you can search for your apps like that. So we've also got the ability, once they're in here, of course, to create new files, whether that's a Word document, Excel document, PowerPoint, etc. You can upload entire folders, let alone individual files. You can download things as well. And of course, we can open everything up in SharePoint. For most of your teachers, I use the analogy that 90% of your teachers are on Facebook, and 10% of them are on Twitter. And that tends more, the tech savvy people tend to be more on Twitter. I know it's not a hard and fast rule, and everybody else is on Facebook. And in the same way, you're going to have 10% of your school that are going to want to open up in SharePoint, and they're going to want to explore all that complexity and all the cool things you can do. But the 90% don't want to know, don't want to be overwhelmed. They just want that simple lens that Teams brings, very much like their OneDrive experience. They have the ability to see their notifications. So most people are on social media, they know how this works, and we're just bringing that sort of experience into the workplace, so they can see what did I miss, what's being brought to my attention, who's tagged me. We've got private chats, of course, their ability to see their teams. The assignments features lives in here, so this is where I talk about that sort of LMS, learning management system stuff, that they can set assignments within Teams. But remembering you could also bring in your existing LMS, right? So if you've got an investment, emotional, financial, whatever, there's no reason why Teams has to be seen as a competition. You can bring that in, and people just don't use the assignment features in Teams. The integration with Calendar we talked about before, calls, and of course I've got access to, these are all the files that I have access to. So it's my own OneDrive. It's going to tell me what I've got access to in Teams, whereas files up here is unique to that individual channel. So that's what Teams looks like. That's what we've unpacked to your leaders and your middle leaders, and really encouraging them to bring this to life in the school. And they're going to need your help, is what it comes down to. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Troy. Let me just share my screen back in. Won't be a second. There we go. Let's get reorganized. That's great. Thanks, Troy, for the quick demonstration of Teams. So I just wanted to talk very quickly now about the Teams client. Obviously, a really important installation if your school's going to look at Teams for all of those capabilities that we have just shared. So the Teams client can be installed either as a standalone app or as part of Microsoft 365 apps. So if it's a standalone, it's an executable, or it can be an MSI if it's for an IT-driven deployment using whatever tools you currently use, whether that be endpoint configuration manager, group policies, etc. But most importantly, once it's installed, it automatically updates. So it's an evergreen client, so you don't really need to worry about it again. End users can postpone the installation of new versions for a period if they choose to do so. But generally speaking, it's going to keep itself up to date and look after itself quite well. We will share this deck with you afterwards for these links. There's some documentation there on getting the client for Microsoft Teams. There's also a link up in the top right-hand side there, which is a link through to the IT Admins Academy for Teams. So it's a library of helpful videos and resources, and well worth taking a look at if you're looking at rolling out Teams in anger within your school environment. Troy, I might just hand back to you actually for the Teams client settings and notifications.
Yeah, look, I wanted to stress that it's really important, because one of the keys to Teams obviously is personalization. There are some policies that you can set for notifications, but they are very basic. And so again, I have taken your teachers through this, but it's something for you to maybe remind them of, and that is that they have the ability to set their own notification levels. That's done through their profile towards the top left of Teams, top right of Teams. When they come into their settings, they can determine what level of notification for what type of activity in Teams that they get. It's really important that if they're getting too many notifications, it becomes white noise and they will stop paying attention to them. And if they're not getting enough, then they're missing important information. So and because coming into Teams, is a complex experience. What they may need at the start, they may want to dial back later on. So teaching them and knowing how to show them, this is your notifications, this is where you do it. So making sure that the notifications are set globally through settings, and then they can hover over each individual channel and set notifications for those individual channels in spite of the global notification settings. And again, we've taken them through and we've shown them that. You can @mention, and again, most people are on social media these days and they understand the idea of tagging. So you can @mention the person, you can @mention the channel, and you can @mention the entire team. And the ability of to turn that on and off is done at a team owner level as well, because what we don't want is everyone tagging the entire school every time, you know, something's happening. So yeah, again, I just want to stress, and you know, why we have a dedicated slide to this is that it does matter. And if you folks could get your head around, you know, showing people where this lives and making sure that they are setting their notifications themselves, they'll have a much better experience.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Troy. It's now time for us to go to a break. You'll be pleased to hear. I saw the comment in the chat window there that head's getting full, brains bursting. I know we've covered a lot. We've got a little bit more content to cover after the break as well. So if we could make that 10 minutes. So by my reckoning, that would be coming back at about 20 past 11, and we'll get into the second part. We'll finish up a little bit on Teams, and then we'll go into some of the Microsoft 365 app stuff. So let's take 10 minutes, back at 20 past 11. Okay, so that should be 10 past by my reckoning. I'm assuming we've got everybody back, so we'll probably dive straight in. Just check, Troy, are you back online?
Yeah, Rich, I'm here.
Fantastic. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll just finish off a little bit on Teams before we dive into the rest of the content. Just probably one point I wanted to make on the Teams client settings slide. Troy did mention it earlier. It's a super important capability to help people with. But the way I work in Teams is if it doesn't light up the alerts in the top left-hand corner, if it doesn't ping the little red bell, then either somebody didn't want me to know about it or I didn't want to know about it. So there are kind of push and pull settings within Teams. So if I need somebody to know about it, it's important to them, I need to use the @mention. So @mention a person or a channel, possibly a whole team, but generally try and keep it to channels or individuals. And if I want to be notified about notifications in a given area, I go in there and I effectively tag that channel. So I make that channel visible and I'll get those notifications pinging up in the top left-hand corner according to those settings that we have on screen now. So everything else I can still get access to, but it's deemed that the person who was posting it or you know, the channel in which it was posted is not something that I'm going to go and necessarily be proactively alerted to. I'm just going to pop in there from time to time and have a bit of a look around and catch up with things. So a couple of tips and tricks. We tried to sprinkle these through the rest of the presentation as well as it relates to the tech. The first one is around naming teams and channels. So we know that when we create a team, it creates a SharePoint library in the background for that team and for each of the channels. When we name the team, that SharePoint library is created with that name. So changing the name of the team or the channel will not change the name of the SharePoint. It's kind of tattooed onto that SharePoint and can create confusion in certain circumstances. So it's not the end of the world, but it's just one of those things. It's nice to have your SharePoint libraries named the same as your teams and or your channels. Just makes it easier for people to navigate and understand. The second one is a bit of a tip. And there's a link here to the meeting roles for Teams meetings. So a lot of what people can do in the meetings is governed by their role within the meeting, whether they are a presenter, such as I am today, or an attendee, or potentially an owner of the meeting as well, which would be, in this case, I think it's Cindy who owns the meeting today. So there are different things that you can do within a meeting based on your role, but also based on the policies that have been set for those roles within that KB article we discussed first. Channel creation is quite an interesting one as well. If we're going to create a private channel, let's make sure we do that off the bat. I don't believe we've changed this, but you still can't change a private channel to a public or vice versa. So think about the structure of channels, engage with the school, with the leadership and the teachers to work out which of those channels might need to be private as the exception to sort of trim that security context, and try and get that right first time. Otherwise, you're deleting channels, recreating as private. The other tip is to try and make sure your teams have at least 2 owners. Don't let it get out of hand. Don't have 50 owners. But as part of that lifecycle management piece, 12 months in, as the default setting, you'll get an email saying you're the owner of this team. Do you wish to renew it? If there's only one person and that person leaves, that then becomes a task for the administrative side of the department. So it's always wise to have 2 or 3 people in there, and then you can kind of self-serve and keep those teams rolling on. And then finally, a little trick at the bottom here. There is a help function in Teams. There's loads of really, really helpful, useful information in there. Key topics, there's training, there's updates on what's new in Teams. Teach your students, sorry, not your students, your teachers to go in there and self-serve a little bit as well. So that was all we wanted to cover on Teams. And then finally, next, we'll just provide a little bit of an update on the browser situation as well. So while the Microsoft 365 platform does support a broad range of browsers, we've announced from our own portfolio, obviously now we have Edge Chromium as our primary browser, that we're going to be ending support for Internet Explorer 11 across Microsoft 365 in August 2021. We've already announced that the old Edge, the original Edge, or Edge Legacy as we call it, is end of life. So whilst IE 11 stopped fully supporting Teams back in November, the rest of Microsoft 365 ends in August. So ultimately, if you're using a Microsoft browser, it will need to be Edge Chromium. Super important that, because we know there's quite a lot of IE 11 and Edge Legacy out there in department schools in South Australia. So very worthwhile updating, upgrading, migrating across to Edge Chromium. So just a little bit on the deployment of Edge Chromium, if it's something that you need to take forward. There's a few ways you can deploy Edge Chromium aside from individual users directly downloading it from the web. So it's available as an MSI package, so you can distribute that via Config Manager or Intune. We're running a pilot with the department at the moment on Intune. There's a few things we need to iron out before it can be rolled out more broadly, or basically any package delivery mechanism that you have for deploying MSI style software. It's also going to be included within Windows updates for various older versions and in the current version of Windows. So from Windows 10 release 20H2, it's actually being included as part of the operating system. So if you're on a modern build of Windows, you're in a good place. You'll have that Edge Chromium browser on there already. Now, why would we think Edge Chromium is a good idea for you, other than because it comes from Microsoft? Well, it's actually all about the compatibility that we've built in. So we've taken the best of what the Chrome open source engine can deliver, that compatibility with websites and all the extensions, and that's kind of where Edge Legacy suffered a little bit. And we've made that available across Windows, Mac OS, iOS, and Android. So it's a truly cross-platform solution. But we've also built in a compatibility mode for IE 11. So if you have applications that will only run in IE 11, we know that some of those are still hanging around in department environments across the country. There's actually a method by which centrally you can specify which sites require IE 11, and it will launch a browser tab in compatibility mode. So it's a pretty good experience in that it opens it in a new tab rather than launching you into a new browser window. So good sorry, let me just jump back. Accidentally clicked. Sorry about that. So again, wonderful compatibility with the websites, compatibility with older sites that require IE 11, but also those things that Microsoft bring as well. So that control, security, and management that you'd expect from Microsoft. There's more than 200 policies available, and privacy controls like tracking prevention as well. So there's some great guidance on configuring Edge for education on docs.microsoft.com that we've linked to here. And Troy will take us through a few of the latest educational features, so that productivity in the classroom in a demo shortly. But before we dive into the Edge Chromium side of things, we'll hand over to Troy again to talk about accessibility, which is one of his true passions. So not only does he run our school transformation program and work with educators all the time, he's also the accessibility lead for Microsoft here in Australia. So Troy, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, I'll get you to skip to the next slide for me. So here's some stats that we have. Up to 50% of instructional time can be lost managing students' needs, including assistive technology. So again, I want to stress to you that we're talking about the schools that you're working in, right? Not just special schools. Virtually 100% of schools in Australia have students with identified learning difficulties enrolled. Doesn't mean they're necessarily funded, but it's identified. Almost 20% of students in Australian schools require inclusive education support. And whilst 30% of New South Wales students from a language background other than English, it's actually about 25% Australia-wide, which means that that's 1 in 4 students are coming into your classes with from a language other than English background. So trying to really share that this is an everybody issue, this is an every school issue, that we're certainly not just talking about special schools or a small percentage of schools. Thanks, Rich. So when we think about building a foundation for success, we want to make sure that students, first of all, have more personalised access to their curriculum. And that's a really key term that we use at Microsoft, is that word personalisation. It's different to differentiation, because differentiation is about the onus on the teacher, making sure that the students have got access, whereas personalisation is about facilitating the fact that the student can choose what that's going to look like. We want to make sure that we optimize educator time as well. So again, making sure that the technology is working and making sure that it's not a burden to the teacher. And then lastly, of course, is improving learning outcomes, right? We want to make sure that, that's the business of schools, which is teaching and learning. And we want to make sure that students are doing exactly that. So these 3 pillars here are important to us in our inclusive classroom. And that is students increase in their independence and also experience a reduction of stigma. We know that kids would often rather miss out than stand out, especially the older they get. So we want to try and be using the same technology as everybody else in the room and the same software as everybody else in the room. And we want to find mainstream applications for a lot of these tools, so that way the student doesn't feel like they stand out. And that's where things like the M365 apps are really important, because if we're in a static version, right, of Office that isn't maturing in terms of features, then kids are going to be missing out on this stuff. So we want to make sure that that's all switched on and ready for them to go. We also want to make sure that the educators are more empowered to engage every learner. So it's not just the personalization, the student is using this technology, but the teachers are using it as well to be able to reach everyone. And then lastly, the institutions that switch this on, schools and peak bodies around the country that switch this on, build reputations as positive places that promote equity and inclusion. By being a member of our school community, you have this. By being a member of our school community, you have access to this, and that's really quite important. Thanks, Rich. So our inclusive classroom is over these 4 different areas: reading support, writing support, math support, and speaking and listening. And so that's core curriculum. When we talk about teaching and learning from Microsoft, people expect us to start with STEM. They expect us to start with coding and this kind of story, but actually we start with literacy. Literacy is actually the base, and not just multiple literacies, but traditional print style literacy, right? So reading support. So what I'm going to do, Rich, I'll get you to skip ahead, is I'm going to take you into a bit of a demo now. I want to show you what Immersive Reader looks like, because this is certainly just the starting point. Rich, I'm going to actually share my screen here. So here we are inside Teams, and as I said a moment ago, this is the starting place for what we do. It's certainly not the final word. But here I am in Teams. I want you to imagine this is a class team. It's not, but imagine that it is. And here we have all our different learning areas. And so they're coming into this channel here. And what happens is the teacher has made a piece of text available to everybody. Now, the teacher is not having to make unique unique versions of this document for all the different children with their different needs. Instead, what happens is the teacher just makes the document available to everybody in Teams, and in doing so, the personalization features are there. So there's a lot of things that we could do. But what I want to show you is what it looks like in Immersive Reader. So the student can come in here, click on View, and turn on Immersive Reader. And when the student turns on Immersive Reader, the first thing we notice is, because it was a Word document, Word has vanished. We're still in Teams though. And by clicking on this little full screen button here, we've now removed all of our bells and whistles and distractions of the app. But inside the document itself, so not having to go into Teams settings, Mac, PC settings, browser settings, nothing. This is all done from inside the document, which is going to make it a lot easier for the student. And I've just realized that I don't think I remembered to share my audio. So excuse me a moment. I'm just going to quickly do that and come back into this document. So what the student is able to do from inside the document is, first, they're able to change their text preferences. So it's all icon based, it's not text based, and it's really easy and intuitive for the student to just do what they need to do to the document. Now, once I've set this, it will remain. And every time I come into this document, as long as I come in on the same, or anytime I come into an Immersive Reader enabled document, regardless of what the original document looked like, it will remember my settings, right? So once the student has set this up, regardless of the app, regardless of the text type, regardless of the font, it's all there as the student wants it to be set up. So there I go, I've set my text size. I've also set my spacing between the letters, spacing between the lines, and spacing between the words is important for things like dyslexia and visual crowding. I've got 3 very simple fonts. I've got the primary teacher's favorite, Comic Sans, which is replicating sort of handwriting. We've also got our ability to change the themes, and if there is source formatting like bold, italic, and underline, we can turn that on and turn that off, which is important because that can be a distraction to the students. All right, so the student has set this up ready to go. Now, what happens for this little girl in particular is that when she comes to a word that she doesn't know, so she may be able to decode and read to a certain point, but she comes to a word that she doesn't know, and then what she can do is she can click on that word and she can get audio support.
Holidays.
All right, so she hears that word. She not only sees it, but she hears it, and that's replicating what the teacher or the aide would do with the student. But if she wants to have the entire document read to her, she can have that as well. Now, I'm just going to quickly mute myself because I don't want you guys to have the feedback.
Last Christmas holidays, I played with my puppy Brandy. I sprayed water at her. I wrestled her and I played soccer with her. We sat down together, we said jokes to each other, we played and played until...
So what it's doing there, it's emulating what an aide would do, which is sit there and read to the student, or a teacher would do, and it's also emulating the following along of the pointing to the word, traditionally with a finger or a pencil, but instead it's emulating that. So what the developers did was they looked at what teachers do, right, without getting drawn into the reading wars of whole language or explicit phonics, etc. They just looked at what teachers did and they copied that. The other thing that that we've got is the ability to slow it down and speed it up, depending on the voice and the accent we're using. We've got male and female, but Australian only has the female accent. All right. Then the other thing that the students can do is they can syllabify, which is just a fancy way of saying chunking the words, right? So if it's a multiple syllable word, it will break that down. Any of you who have your own children will know that when you're teaching kids to read, you're helping them to break the word down. So again, it's imitating what the teachers do. We can highlight our parts of speech. So we can highlight the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, and the adverbs. We can change those colors if students have trouble with color differentiation. But remembering that, and I need to stress, we are connected to the internet for this to work. But I want to show you something that's really cool. So we see that our nouns are green and our verbs are red. But yet here we see tag as a noun, and here we see tag as a verb, because what's happened is the AI is actually contextualizing the parts of speech. So I played tag with her. Tag is the name of the game. It's a noun, but she got to tag me with her tail, which is a verb. So the AI is actually contextualizing the parts of speech, which is pretty amazing. The other thing that we can do is if students really have trouble with the colors, we can show our labels like that. All right, so a moment ago, the document looked like this. Now what's happening is the student with setting her own settings as she's done and personalizing the document every time she turns it on, it's going to look exactly what she needs. And we have to balance support and challenge. Too much challenge, student can't grow. Too much support, the student won't grow either. Lastly, I guess I want to show you is a couple over here, these features here, which are our reading preferences. So we can turn on line focus again, which is what teachers do all the time. We've also got, which is covering the unimportant portions of the text and reducing distraction. We've got picture dictionary, which is nice as well. So now what happens is when I click on a word, I can see it and hear it.
Puppy.
But I can also get the picture prompts, again, imitating what teachers do. This is not contextualized though, so it will bring up multiple potential definitions for the teacher. And then or for the student, and then we've got translate, and translate's where it gets really, really cool. So for example, if our student was Korean, and her home language is Korean, her dominant language is Korean, now what happens is when she comes to a word she doesn't know, she can see it and hear it in English.
Christmas.
And see it and hear it in Korean.
크리스마스.
Right? Chances are she knows that one. Sounds very similar. Have a look at this one. Played.
Played. 연주.
Okay, seeing it and hearing it as well as picture prompts, which is from an EAL perspective, is English as an additional language. Again, there's those acronyms. It's a game changer, but we can translate the entire document as well. Let me just mute myself.
지난 크리스마스 휴가 나는 내 강아지 브랜디와 함께 연주. 나는 그녀에게 물을 뿌려 했다.
So you can see there, we've got a really nice natural sounding voice, both in English and in Korean. And notice it's an Australian accent. We can go backwards and forwards. Different languages have different capabilities. So this, for example, Korean is able to show us the parts of speech and it can speak to us. But, the different languages that we have different features. Things are being rolled out all the time. Now, this is going to be available to you in different apps. Right, and again, I want to stress this is why we want to get M365 and get everyone onto the latest versions, but it's available in the browser as well. So that's what that looks like. I'm not sure what our next slide is, Rich, because I can't see the slide deck.
It would just be to jump into the Edge side of things, Troy, very quickly.
Yeah, cool. So looking at the Edge browser as well, the Edge browser is really cool. And remembering that we do need to have the most up-to-date version of Edge, and this can be grabbed, from the Edge website and downloading it. What I'm about to show you, we're not at all advocating that this is the only browser that anyone would ever use. Certainly, schools and school devices can have multiple browsers. But why this matters is what we're doing around teaching and learning, and the fact that we have built Immersive Reader into the Edge browser. Now, to be able to do this on Chrome, you would need multiple extensions, and some of those are paid. But this is free and totally inclusive, included with the Windows 10 most up-to-date version of Edge. So what happens here is I'm on this website here, the Phases of the Moon. You've got bells and whistles and colors and buttons and so much going on. You've got the text here. You've got the text mixed in with photographs and graphics. You've got ads along the side. For a lot of our kids, this is too much. But we need to be able to keep what matters from the website, right? So we've got the Immersive Reader button that lives up here. So when we open the website, we can see we come in to Immersive Reader. And again, we can have that read to us. Multiple accents, multiple languages. We can change our text size, increase and decrease. We can change our spacing, the themes. Grammar tools are there as well. Syllabification, nouns, verbs, adjectives and verbs, all there for us. We've got line focus. We've got the picture dictionary, and we've got the ability to translate into multiple languages. Now, what that means for a student means that instead of seeing this and being locked out, every time the student comes in, it's going to remember the settings and the important graphics remain. We don't want to be removing graphics from a website, as you could imagine, right? So they are still there, even though the ads and the things at the side are gone. Now, as technical people, I want to stress a couple of things. First of all, sometimes Immersive Reader will be seen by a website as ad stripper software and simply won't work. All right, it will be disabled. So when teachers come saying, why is this not working? That may be why. However, if that does happen, you can highlight pieces of text, right click it, and you can open just that portion in Immersive Reader. So that should overcome this this issue of ad stripper. You can also do things like just read that aloud and translate that without having to turn on the entire Immersive Reader. Another thing I want to share with you is what's called collections. So I can add websites to collections, and collections live up here. And this is a great tool for students. In fact, I use this all the time myself. So when you, good. So when you come into a collection, you can collect anything that is important to that domain that you're researching or that you're wanting to keep without having to keep it all in bookmarks. You know how it is. Bookmarks get very full, very convoluted very quickly. So you can see here I was doing a presentation to TAFE NSW. Instead of having a folder and all that, I can just add pages here, okay? But where it gets really cool is my ability to then send that group of links to Excel, to OneNote, to Word, to Pinterest, sort by the date. I can open them all. So for example, if I wanted to, I could just click on that and that would open them all in a new browser window. I can copy them, etc. I can also keep notes inside here as well. So this is a really cool feature for educators and students alike. The other thing I want to draw your attention to, lastly, around Edge is the ability to have multiple profiles. So you can see here, I come in, I work obviously with different departments, different schools, and as long as I've got an M365 account for those, I can have multiple profiles with different settings, etc. For your students, though, it means that they can have their own personal profile and their own, setting up a free Microsoft 365 account, and they can also have their 365 department account, which means they can keep their world separate. So too for teachers, of course, right? So, I've got my personal one, which is where I keep all my links to everything I need to do in that space. But when I want to use Microsoft, it all lives there. When I want to use department, so you can see how that would work with just the two basic profiles that you might have. But it really simplifies things. And then you can obviously keep those, those multiple profiles can exist as multiple launch icons, either on your desktop or on your toolbar. And it's just really, really quite convenient. So yeah, I just wanted to stress this is why the Edge browser is important from a teaching and learning perspective, from an inclusivity and equity perspective, and encourage you to make sure that that's rolled out and that teachers have access to that. Or when they come to you wanting admin access, please let them install that tool.
That's great. Thanks, Troy. So much more in the Edge browser than just a browser. So it's become really, really important. So wanted to also step through and look at the Microsoft 365 apps, where we have a kind of similar story, I suppose, if we look historically at how Microsoft has released software. So Office 2010, 2013, 2016, waiting 3 years for new capabilities and features to turn up. More recently, we've released Office 365 Pro Plus, or now Microsoft 365 apps, which is iterating on a monthly basis. So some of those features that Troy's talked about, as we switch them on on the back end in the Office 365 services, are only going to be lit up if we have the most up-to-date, most productive, most secure version of Microsoft 365 apps running on the client side as well. So I think the next slide is particularly instructive. So this is from the period between the release of 2016 Office and 2019, what was happening in the M365 app space. So this is a cumulative list of features and capabilities released on a 6-monthly basis, or summarizing the 6 months through spring and fall. Apologies for the American terminology, and of course that's Northern Hemisphere. but you look at the mountain of features that you've got by fall 2019 that you wouldn't have if you'd installed Office 2016. There's a bunch of extra features that have been released since then, but some of these are critical to the educational experience. So if we just look at things like Translator, for example, turned up in 2018, you wouldn't have that if you had Office 2016. Learning Tools 2017, you wouldn't have those if if you'd installed Office Pro Plus 2016. So I guess this is us imploring you to make sure that when you roll out Office in your school, it's not 2016, it's not 2019, it's the Microsoft 365 apps version of Office. Otherwise, there will be things that are missing that your teachers, leadership are going to come back asking for. If we can find a way to do that en masse so that the school is consistent, everybody's on the same version, everybody's on the latest and greatest, that's so much more helpful as well, because different teachers are experiencing the same level of capability through Microsoft 365. If you've got somebody on 2016, somebody on 2019, somebody on M365 apps, that becomes really, really difficult to manage. So when it comes to deploying Microsoft 365 apps, we have heaps of tools and guidance available. So we've provided a link to docs.microsoft.com on these slides. We can't cover all the content in one day, but we've pulled out some of the more important considerations for you. Bearing in mind each environment is different. You may have existing processes and tools for rolling out software. So the guidance will be a little bit generic over the next couple of slides rather than specific to each school. So those key considerations really: how to deploy, how do you manage updates, and what's your update channel for Microsoft 365 apps? And then we've got a couple of tips, tricks, and gotchas. So options for deploying, we put together a table here as a bit of a ready reckoner for you. So it includes the various options for deploying M365 apps, the most common ones, and when to use which, and covers some of the pros and cons, like what's the impact on bandwidth, and do you require any kind of local admin permissions or anything like that. So generally speaking, we sort of start at the top as the preference. If you've got Config Manager, if we can extend the reach of Intune within the department, they're going to be the primary tools. It makes sense to use those if that's what you're using today. If you don't have those tools in place, but you still want to do a kind of a broad rollout within your environment and install Microsoft 365 apps on a range of a number of devices, you can use the Office Deployment Toolkit for either a local or a cloud-based installation. So options 3 and 4. Option 5 is what Troy showed earlier. When you looked at office.com, there's an option to download Microsoft 365 apps. So that's where we get into this situation of a lack of consistency within your school. And option 6 is the final option, which is baking it into the OS image that you're going to be using. So maybe that's a piece of work we could look at more broadly as to if you're using image-based deployment, then is there a way we can bring that into the image. In terms of guidance, I'd probably, apart from the doc side of things, there's a really good click-through interactive guide that I've linked to on this particular slide. It's probably about half an hour to go through it. I'd strongly recommend that. It sort of takes you through these configurations click by click using the Office Deployment Toolkit, the customization toolkit, and whether that's just deployed from a local share using Config Manager or deploying via Intune. So definitely well worth taking a look at. So that's the kind of all we'll talk about on deployment guidance. But the update side of things is also really important. So how are we going to handle updates? Are we going to update automatically from the internet? So this is what we see as the most commonly selected option nowadays. Keeps everything up to date and requires sort of minimal admin overhead. It's also really great for remote workers, which we've seen a lot of around the world recently. Maybe a little bit less so in South Australia than some other states, and certainly overseas. We don't need to have that administrative reach with things like Config Manager can sometimes be troublesome to get updates out to remote workers. So, but if you do need more control over the environment, how the updates are rolled out, then we definitely recommend a tool such as Config Manager, or pushing out on-premise updates through a group policy, using the ODT. So yeah, a few options there in terms of how you manage updates. And then in terms of update channels as well, so this is something you need to understand. It is a tenant-wide setting. So if you are in the central tenant, which you guys all are, and you've installed Microsoft 365 apps, the default will be current channel, which is basically to get the new features as soon as they're ready, which obviously keeps everybody up to date. So ensuring consistency across the board here again is key. Finally, a couple of tips, tricks, and gotchas. So the first one here is if you've been around a while deploying Office and Visio and Project and Access, you'll know there's some occasionally a compatibility challenge with an MSI version of, I don't know, Project 2016 and Microsoft 365 apps. So there is actually a compatibility matrix that we've linked to. So we won't go into that in detail, just to be aware that that can happen. It's always wise to remove any existing versions of Office before we install Microsoft 365 apps. And there are also options to look at if you've got shared device scenarios, so machines in shared areas or labs or potentially carts of trolleys of machines that come into a room. Think about the options for shared computer activation or device-based activation, and talk to the guys in the department about what's appropriate, what options are available there. And then finally, for all those updates and installations, really need to be looking at delivery optimization to make sure we're minimizing the use of bandwidth across between sites and between your site and the updates on the internet. So that was all we're going to cover on Microsoft 365. The key takeaway we really wanted to land is if you're not on the current version of Microsoft 365 apps, then there will be features and functions that are not available within your environment that teachers and leadership will be hoping or expecting to have. So coming into the kind of home straight now, I suppose, we'll just take a quick look at OneDrive. You'll probably all be familiar with this, but basically it's the kind of files application in Microsoft 365. So it enables users to organize and store files in the cloud where they can be shared and co-authored in real time. We sometimes forget about the importance of this, but it's often the first step towards creating a collaborative environment in a school. But because OneDrive uses SharePoint services at the back end, all the files this is OneDrive for Business, let me be clear. Files are also secured and protected and become subjected to those common platform services we've talked about on several occasions, like e-discovery, retention hold, etc. So you get 5 terabytes of storage per user with a OneDrive for Business, which should be more than enough for most people. And we would recommend that this is considered the primary place for personal file storage. So as you work together on files in Microsoft 365, I suppose we've got 3 areas where these are surfaced up, all kind of underpinned by a consistent, intelligent file experience driven out of SharePoint on the back end. So often we get the question, well, when do we use OneDrive? When do we use Teams? When do we use SharePoint? Which tool is the best? So there aren't really any hard and fast rules, but the recommendations we have, if you have all 3 solutions available, is that think of OneDrive as the place where you work on your own files and then share things selectively. So often start a file in OneDrive and then share it out. Teams is the place where you work with a closer group of people on collaborative creation. And I sort of start in Teams if I know it's going to be a shared collaboration on that document. And then finally, SharePoint really is the place where you store and share documents much more broadly across the audience. So, there's a few considerations there, but often I'll start a file in OneDrive. It'll end up being uploaded to Teams when I'm ready to share it more broadly. It may even end up in a pure SharePoint library at a later stage if it becomes something to be shared more broadly. So just think about that hierarchy. So there's a couple of options for accessing for the end users. You've got the web interface via 365 or the mobile apps with storage purely in the cloud, or you have the sync client that can be installed on the local machine, whether it's a Mac or PC. Pretty straightforward installation that we'll touch on in a moment. So we'd strongly recommend this is one of the first things you do in terms of getting your school and your teachers and leadership used to operating in the cloud. So couple of tips and tricks. We've got a link there to the OneDrive adoption resources. We also think you should take a look at known folder redirection, whether that's done via group policy or config manager. So users can continue to use those familiar folder locations they used to, but in the background, we're redirecting them up to OneDrive. So the documents files are stored in the cloud. If a machine breaks, got a hard disk failure or gets stolen or misplaced, or there's some issue with that machine, jump onto another machine, log in, all your OneDrive information's there, available to be reconnected to. And then finally, a little tip there in terms of files on demand. So this really is, for you to understand how files on demand works and use it appropriately with your users. So are the files stored locally and synchronized up to the cloud? Are they cloud only, so available through the browser client, or are they available on demand, which means there's kind of like a stub of the file left in the client, and then it downloads upon usage. So, if you've got people who are storing vast quantities of documents in OneDrive, you may find there's not enough space on their hard drive, depending on the nature of their machine. So you might want to look at files on demand as a way of mitigating some of those challenges. So that's OneDrive. And then the final piece really is just a little bit of candy to finish with. Last year, we created and released some SharePoint school templates. So we have 3 that we did in our initial run. The first of which is pure SharePoint. It's a school homepage. So we've done some of the hard work of, nicely formatting a communication site that you can use as your school intranet homepage. Definitely worth a look, and we've linked off to the repository where these are. But we also created a couple of other pages, a staff homepage and a class homepage. Now, these are a little bit different, and perhaps hints at the direction that we're going in the future, is that these are SharePoint sites that are designed to be embedded within teams. So, a staff homepage goes into a staff team, a class homepage goes into that class team. And it really, highlights the difference in how content is presented through natively in Teams versus SharePoint. So if we're looking for that really rich formatting capability, images, lots of lists of links, and all the stuff that we're very familiar in doing in SharePoint, these are a really good option to sort of jazz up your Teams environment and point off to other locations or bring in rich content. Sometimes the content in Teams can be a little bit more chat-based or file-based. So there's a link there in the presentation, which we'll make available through the team at the department. Worth having a look at if your school is either lacking or needs to refresh the intranet homepage, or you're interested in embedding some of those templates into staff teams and class teams. And we are bang on 12 o'clock, and we've just finished the last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. So I know we've delivered a lot of information there. I see there's been a bit of chat going on in the window there, so we'll get around to that. But if anybody has any questions they want to jump off mute now and ask, or are happy to run it through the chat window, that's the end of today's session. We'd like to thank you for attending. We'd like to thank everybody for being part of this school transformation program, and also thank the team from the department who've been instrumental in making sure this content is appropriate for your environment. So I'll stop there. Troy, I don't know whether you have any final words, or Cindy, Scott, and the team like to add.
No, I'm all good, Richard. I've said all I need to say, but I will say this is the last session for our STP, so it's been a very full month, and I'm really glad. Better the end than the beginning of something, as they say.
No, nothing on my side, just to thank both Richard and Troy for today. And I see Simon's just asked about the link for the recording. I'll send everyone an email later today with the link as well as a survey.
I'm just going to add on this page with the school homepage that creates a new SharePoint site where the other 2 replace the existing Teams SharePoint site. So just keep that in mind. Also, that school homepage is more of a intranet for the school, which every school should have as part of the SharePoint migration project. So, which you can't really replace that one with this one. This would be a new site. So you probably want to still use your existing intranet page for that purpose. There's also another thing which will be changing soon with the way recordings, as was just mentioned, they'll be moving from being stored on stream to OneDrive or SharePoint as in the team site. That needs to be done by June the 1st, I believe. So there'll be some sort of communication going about that when it changes across. That's all I had.
That's awesome. Thanks, Scott. Great to have that context of the environment here as well, because we don't know everything about your environment. But look, we really hope that's been helpful. We welcome your feedback as well, suggestions as to how we can make this better for the next cohort of schools. And obviously, Troy and I are here to support the department team as you look to roll out Microsoft 365 and support the great work that the educators and leaders at your schools are doing. So thanks so much for your attendance today. Really appreciate it.